Okay, so we are now recording. And this is just to show you guys what I've put into the Unit 4 folders. I just want to make sure that just like usual, you know the resources that you have available to study from and that you should be using. So here is the first one. You know, as usual, you have the study outline, you have the PowerPoint, and then you have the web page. So on this one, this is the beginning of the study outline. So it begins with the nutrients and then an overview of metabolism. These, if you haven't been watching these videos, not the ones that I've made, which hopefully you have been using too, but these other ones, the crash course videos, they are really good. So, and they're not long. So please do use these. They really will help with your understanding of the information, I think. So you have one of those here. And then if you scroll down, this is continuing just the overview of metabolism. And here's another really good one. Then you have, so I'm going to go to the other Unit 4 folder. So go through that one first, because that kind of sets up the background for the big stuff, like the major processes related to metabolism. In the second folder, you have a lecture from me, and this is a somewhat longer one. So again, you have the study outline, you have the PowerPoint, and then if you go to the web page, same kind of thing. You have some written information, and then you have a couple of videos. This is another crash course video. That's great. But included also in this folder is a lecture that I recorded covering metabolism. It is about half an hour. So it is a little bit longer than the small little lectures that I typically have embedded in the web pages, because this is a tricky unit. And I wanted to give you like a lot of content with the ability to pause the recording and take notes. So basically this metabolism review right here, it does a quick overview of the first couple of pages, which I'm actually going to lecture on and let you guys fill in the outline today. So I'll give you like filled in notes for the first probably 4 or 5 pages. That this video though does a quick overview of that, and then it covers the entire section that's titled aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. This is the major process that involves the breakdown of carbohydrates. So we'll be discussing that a little bit today, but you have the entire lecture for that section. So it is multiple pages. It's all of aerobic respiration, which includes glycolysis. It includes the oxidation of pyruvic acid. So if you're looking at your outline, that probably, my numbering is slightly off, but I think that is for you guys, pages 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So that recorded lecture is going to cover a lot of the study outline. So please make sure that you look at this. That's really going to help. And that is a tricky section. So that's really going to help with your understanding of that section of aerobic respiration. I'll touch on it a little bit today, but since I already have this, I don't want to completely repeat myself and waste our time. So what I plan to do is start with just the very beginning of the outline with the major nutrients, and then I'll maybe do like a quick overview of just what aerobic respiration is, knowing that you have this recorded lecture to watch and to use to fill in your notes. And then I'll skip to a later section of the study outline that you don't necessarily have a recorded lecture for. All right, so that is the plan for today. I'm going to stop sharing that, and I will, let me see, I'll share the PowerPoint. Okay. All right, so the first part of the PowerPoint and the first part of your study outline really just covers some basics regarding diet and nutrition, including the major nutrients, and really what the function of those nutrients is in the body, what purpose they serve. So if you look at your outline, you can see the main macronutrients. These are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And then micronutrients, which we only require a very small amount of, are the vitamins and minerals. So we'll start with the macronutrients, beginning with carbohydrates. So as far as dietary sources of carbohydrates, most of these are derived from plants. There are different categories of carbohydrates. If you guys remember from the beginning of the last unit, we did talk a little bit about the major organic molecules in the body and that we ingest in our diet, which includes carbs, proteins, and lipids. So you would have read about the different classes of carbohydrates. So monosaccharides are the smallest. These are the simple sugars. Disaccharides are two monosaccharides put together. So they're just a little bit bigger. And then polysaccharides, poly means many. So polysaccharides are many monosaccharides, many simple sugars joined together. So for the first two, monosaccharides and disaccharides, these generally in our diet come from fruit, milk, and honey. And the polysaccharides, so these are the really large carbohydrates, these typically come from grains and vegetables. And we find those in the form of starch and fiber.
I'm sorry, did you say the disaccharides were the fruit, milk, and honey?
Yeah, mono and di.
Okay.
Both of them are from those sources, yeah. Okay, so polysaccharides are generally come from vegetables and grains. So speaking of fiber, because a lot of these are in the form of fiber, there are two different types of fiber, soluble and insoluble. So insoluble fiber is found in most vegetables and can't be digested. But soluble fiber, the other type, is found in several different sources. It's found in fruit, it's in apples and oranges. And that can be digested, unlike the insoluble fiber. Okay. So the main use in the body for carbohydrates is to obtain glucose. So really quickly, glucose is a monosaccharide, and any carbohydrate that you ingest can be broken down or converted into glucose. So no matter what you're eating, if it's a polysaccharide, a disaccharide, or a different monosaccharide, it can be converted into glucose. So all carbohydrates can ultimately become glucose, and the use for glucose in the body is to be used by cells to produce ATP. Okay. I'm trying, I have a poll question. So I'm going to share that before I continue. Okay. You should be able to see the poll now popping up on your screen. So the next thing we'll talk about is like basically what percentage of your diet should consist of carbohydrates. And then we'll talk about the same thing for proteins, fats, and the micronutrients. And this is based on the dietary recommendations that are published by the US government. Now, if you need to be on like a special type of diet for any reason, that obviously could change things. But for like a normal individual not suffering from any sort of disease or, you know, on any particular type of diet, I'll give you the percentages in that situation. So let me see. It looks like we've had most people respond. And we were almost equal between proteins and carbs. Now the answers for carbohydrates have taken the lead. Okay, and even more. All right, so I will end the poll. Here's the final results. So the correct answer is carbohydrates. And what you can fill in your outline is the dietary requirement for carbohydrates. They typically say should be between 45 and 65% of your total calorie intake. So that is more than the other options that I listed. And we'll go through those so you'll see. Okay, next one is lipids, the next macronutrient. And there are different sources of lipids in our diet. We did discuss in the last unit that triglycerides are the most abundant lipid in our diets and in our bodies. And there's a couple different types of triglycerides. I'm sure you've probably heard of saturated fats and unsaturated fats. So the saturated fats tend to come from meat, dairy, and hydrogenated oils. And that would be something like margarine or like shortening, like Crisco. The unsaturated fats are what we call the healthy fats. And sources of unsaturated fats are things like seeds and nuts, olive oil. Okay. Another type of lipid is cholesterol. And cholesterol is found in egg yolks. It's found also in meat, in dairy, okay, and then the last one listed is essential fatty acids. So I've given you in your outline a couple examples of these. There's linoleic acid and linolenic acid. They sound very similar. If you've heard of like omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, that's what these are. So they're called essential fatty acids because they are essential in your diet and in your body, because they have important uses in the body. And you absolutely have to have them present in your diet. So we do tend to get them just from eating a balanced diet, but it is important to get those omega fatty acids. So in terms of uses in the body, there are multiple things or multiple functions that lipids serve. First of all, these can be a source of energy after glucose is used up. Remember when we discussed carbohydrates, I said that glucose is the main molecule that your cells use to get energy from. So your cells will always use glucose first if it's available. If it gets used up or if glucose is not available, the second choice is fat. So then your body will start to use fat for energy if glucose is used up. So this also is a source for energy, but typically only after glucose is pretty much gone. Another thing is that there is fat located in adipose tissue. If you remember your different types of tissues from Anatomy 1, adipose tissue is the yellowish looking tissue that stores fat. So the fat stores in your adipose tissue provide insulation and cushioning around internal organs. Okay, another type of lipids called phospholipids. They form myelin. You guys remember the term myelin, the myelin sheath, which covers some of your neurons in your body. So myelin is that white covering on some neurons. If you guys remember, it helped to like speed up a nerve impulse as it was passing along a neuron. So phospholipids are important for forming myelin. Okay, also absorption. Lipids help with the absorption of fat soluble vitamins. We'll learn in a couple minutes, we'll talk about vitamins, and you'll learn that there are water soluble vitamins and lipid soluble vitamins. And those that are lipid soluble have to be absorbed in your digestive tract along with lipids. If there are no lipids present in your digestive tract, they can't be absorbed, and therefore they can't be used or stored by the body. So they just get like excreted and you can't even benefit from them. Okay, and also cholesterol. I mentioned cholesterol as one of the types of lipids that's in our diet, and cholesterol is used to make bile salts. Remember when we did the lipid digestion lab in person during the last couple of weeks, we talked about bile salts and how the bile salt part of bile is what actually does the job of bile, which is to like physically break apart big pieces of fat. So cholesterol is actually used to make those bile salts. And another thing, cholesterol is also used to make certain hormones in your body. Okay, so next thing is just the dietary requirement for lipids. It's said that these should make up about 20 to 35% of your total calorie intake. Okay, so the last major macronutrient is protein. And proteins come from two main sources. They come from animal products, which typically provide the highest quality protein. And when I say high quality protein, what that means is that protein contains like a lot of different amino acids. Okay, so a high quality protein is one that contains many different amino acids. So the highest quality proteins do tend to come from animal products. So that would be, I mean, you have some examples here like meats and eggs and fish. But proteins are also found in non-animal products, things like legumes, which are beans, also nuts, different nuts, cereals. However, these do tend to have lower quality proteins. They do tend to be lower quality proteins, which means that they typically don't have quite as many different amino acids in them. All right, so as far as uses in the body, proteins have a lot of really important functions in the body. I've not even listed all of them because it would take a while, but I listed some of the major ones. First of all, they provide some of the main structural materials in the body. Have you heard of collagen? So collagen is like a fiber, a protein fiber that's found in many tissues in the body. It's found in your skin, it's found in connective tissue. Keratin is a protein, and keratin is found in hair and nails and it makes nails hard. So it helps with the structure of those things. Also, remember that you have proteins that are found in your muscles, like actin and myosin. These are the proteins that actually can move, and they allow your muscles to basically contract and relax. So proteins form a lot of the major structural materials that go into building, like the tissues that form your body. Another thing is that proteins act as enzymes and hormones. Okay, so we've talked about enzymes with the digestive system. Enzymes initiate and or speed up reactions in the body. And hormones you discussed with the endocrine system in Anatomy and Physiology 1 class. Basically, hormones regulate many different body functions. So there's other things too. They play a role in immunity. Remember hemoglobin we talked about with the respiratory system. The globin part of hemoglobin is a protein. So without protein, you couldn't have hemoglobin, which means you couldn't carry a lot of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood. So they are absolutely essential for living. The last thing I have under uses for proteins is that they can serve as a source of energy for the body, but it's not your body's first choice. Remember, you're always going to use glucose first if it's available. If not, then you'll use fat. Only if necessary will your body actually use proteins for energy. And that's mainly because proteins serve so many other purposes in the body. They're used for so many other things, like making hormones, like forming collagen and keratin as the structural materials in your skin and your hair. So we generally don't want to just kind of waste it by using it for energy if we have other things that we can use for energy, like glucose. So typically it's not used by your cells for energy. And then as far as the dietary requirement for protein, it typically, or it should, make up anywhere between 10 and 35% of your total calorie intake. Okay, one more thing related to proteins. All the amino acids contain nitrogen. So all proteins, because they're made up of amino acids, all proteins contain nitrogen. So they, just having proteins in your body is the major nitrogen that's found in your body is found in these proteins. So there is a nitrogen balance that your body seeks to maintain. You don't want to have too much, you don't want to have too little. So the nitrogen balance is generally determined by the rate that you're making new proteins compared to the rate that you're breaking down proteins. So the rate of protein synthesis that you're making new proteins should be about the same as the rate that your body is breaking down proteins. And if that's the case, then you're going to have a relatively stable nitrogen balance. You're not going to have too much, like if you had too many proteins being made, and you're not going to have too little if you had too many proteins being broken down. As long as they're made at the same rate that they're broken down, nitrogen balance is going to stay the same. And that's good. That's what we want generally. You would see a positive nitrogen balance. So this would be if you're making more proteins than you're breaking down. You would see that in situations like during periods of time of extreme growth or tissue repair. So in a child, for instance, if they're having a growth spurt and they are, the body is just making a lot of new tissues at that time to support growth, then you would probably see more proteins being made than are being broken down. So you would have a positive nitrogen balance. Negative nitrogen balance is the opposite situation. So it's when protein synthesis is occurring at a much lower rate than decomposition. So your body is breaking down proteins way more than it's making new proteins. And this is not good. Usually something bad has happened. So examples of when you would see this is in an individual suffering from a serious injury or suffering from malnutrition or starvation. Because in that case, if you're not getting enough calories in your diet, your body is going to start to break down its existing tissues. And it will start with fat stores, but they can get used up, within a few days or a week or two, depending on how much you have. And then after that point, it's going to start breaking down other tissues like your muscles. And muscles are primarily made of protein. So that's when you would see a negative nitrogen balance. And when you see that, it's detrimental to the body. It's not good. Okay, so that finishes up the macronutrients. The next two things are micronutrients. So we have these in much smaller amounts in our diet. Starting with the vitamins, these are organic compounds that are needed for growth and for various reactions that are taking place in the body. A lot of vitamins serve as coenzymes. And I think, let me see, you do have a definition of that in your outline. A coenzyme is a vitamin that acts or that helps an actual enzyme perform a chemical reaction. Most vitamins can't be made by the body. So that means they have to be part of your diet. And there are two classifications of vitamins. They're shown on the PowerPoint slide here. There are fat or lipid soluble vitamins, and then there are water soluble vitamins. The water soluble vitamins are absorbed with water in the digestive tract. So they are absorbed along with water in the digestive tract. And one other thing about them, any amount that's not used within like an hour or two gets excreted in urine. Okay, so basically any excess amount of these vitamins that your body doesn't use right away doesn't get stored. It gets excreted from the body. The other type of vitamin are the fat or lipid soluble vitamins. These types of vitamins bind to lipids that you've ingested. And they get absorbed with those lipids. And they also get stored in the body with those lipids. Okay, so the main difference is water-soluble vitamins get absorbed along with water, and they cannot be stored in the body. Fat-soluble vitamins get absorbed along with fats, and they can be stored in the body. So that's the big difference. And there are various diseases and syndromes that can occur in the body based on having too much or too little of a particular vitamin. So, I mean, there's a ton that I could list. These exist for every single type of vitamin that you have. So I'm not going to go through all the different diseases and disorders that can result. I'll give you a couple of examples though. And in general, if you are not getting enough of a particular vitamin, that's called hypovitaminosis. So that is the first term or the next term listed in your outline, hypovitaminosis. So that's not getting enough. It's a vitamin deficiency. I've given you two examples of a hypovitaminosis disease. So the first one is called rickets, and this results from a deficiency of vitamin D. So what happens with rickets is if you don't have, if you're lacking vitamin D, then your body is not able to absorb calcium well. Vitamin D actually helps with calcium absorption. So without sufficient vitamin D, the body has decreased calcium absorption. And think about one of the main things that calcium helps with before you guys write anything else. Calcium, a lot of calcium goes into your bones, and then the bones get calcified. So it helps with the hardening of your bones. So now you can write this down. Think about what would happen if you have a deficiency of calcium. It's going to lead to the softening of bones because they are not calcifying. They're not hardening. So you'll have softening of bones, and think about if your bones are not as hard as they should be. They can bend a little, right? Especially the bones that you're putting weight on, like your legs. Look at like these femurs here. So if you're putting weight on bones and they are a little bit soft, like they're not soft like a spaghetti noodle. They can still support you, but they're not as hard as they should be. So gradually they can bend. See how femurs should normally look perfectly straight. And in someone with rickets, they can bow out a little bit. So as a result of this, you'll have bone softening, and then it can lead to bone deformities because the bones are bending. And the other example is the name of the disease is called pernicious anemia. And this is a deficiency of vitamin B12. So if you have low vitamin B12, then you'll actually lack the ability to make normal red blood cells. This vitamin is involved in the process of making red blood cells. So if you have a deficiency of vitamin B12, your body cannot make a sufficient amount of normal red blood cells. So as a result, you're lacking red blood cells, and they are sort of an abnormal shape too. You can kind of tell, here's normal red blood cells, and here's red blood cells from someone suffering from pernicious anemia. So there's less, and they have a slightly different shape too. So they're not quite normal. And that can lead to, if you have pernicious anemia, it can lead to fatigue and weight loss. Okay, so those are two examples of diseases that result from a hypovitaminosis condition where you have a vitamin deficiency. But you can have diseases resulting from hypervitaminosis, which is when you have too much too much of a certain vitamin. So you have excess of a particular vitamin. And a lot of times, like, people think you can't really have too much of a good thing, but you actually can. In this case, you can have too much of a particular vitamin and it can lead to a disease. It can become toxic in the body if you have too many. So think about this. So hypervitaminosis is when you have too much of a particular vitamin building up. Remember, we talked about the two types of vitamins, water soluble and lipid soluble. Which category do you think this is going to happen with? A buildup of too much of a vitamin.
Fat soluble?
Right. It can actually only really happen with the fat soluble vitamins because those are the ones that can be stored by the body. It would be really difficult to have this happen with the water soluble vitamins, because remember, they don't get stored in the body. Any excess amount gets excreted. So it'd be really hard to have too much of the water soluble vitamins in your body, because if you have too much of them, it gets excreted in your urine. So almost always we see this, if this is going to happen, it's going to happen with the fat soluble, lipid soluble vitamins. So yeah, they can at times, if you're getting too much, if you're taking too much of a supplement, it can build up to a toxic level in the body. And it can even cause death if it's a really, really extreme amount. Okay, so the other micronutrients are, in addition to the vitamins, are minerals. And if you remember, I mentioned that vitamins are organic molecules. If something's organic, it contains carbon, and it tends to be a little bit bigger. Minerals are inorganic. So these are smaller and they don't contain carbon. So these are naturally occurring. There are several minerals that have essential functions in the body. The big ones that you need to have in your body are listed on the left side of this chart. So definitely things like sodium and calcium. Think about, do you remember like the nerve impulse a little bit? Remember, it involves the movement of ions in and out of the neuron. And those ions involved are sodium and chloride. So you absolutely have to have those in order to have a nerve impulse in your body. Also, you might remember with muscle contractions, you have to have calcium. That is involved in the muscle contraction process. So without calcium, you actually can't have a muscle contraction. And also, we just talked about the other really important function of calcium is to move into your bone tissue and help with the hardening of bones. So you can see, just as those few examples, you can see the importance of some of these minerals in the body. You really couldn't live without some of them.
Is there such thing as too much calcium?
There honestly, with everything, you can have too much or too little of almost any of these. But fortunately, our bodies are pretty, for the most part, able to get rid of excess amounts. I mean, we talked about like with the lipid soluble vitamins, we can't, so that can be an issue. And there are ways of getting rid of excess amounts of minerals. And we can regulate these mainly through excreting them through urine. So our urinary system is really important at getting rid of excess amounts of these things. So if you have too much calcium, too much sodium, it can be excreted in your urine. Yeah, so good question. All right. Let me see. I am going to move on to the next section. I was just looking to see if I had a poll question, and I don't yet for this section. So I'll keep going. This is the next section, just continuing with your study outline, is an overview of some of the metabolic reactions. So I'll go through those reactions, and then I am going to skip to a part towards the end of the outline, because the next section I'll get to is the section where you have that whole recorded outline of me going over all that stuff. So here we're getting to just major reaction types that are occurring in the body. And basically the term metabolism is referring to like all of the reactions that are occurring in your cells involving those nutrients that we just talked about. And generally, like if we just generalize metabolism, there's two major types of reactions that occur. And then there are all different like subtypes of reactions that fall into one of these two categories. But the two main categories of reactions are catabolism and anabolism. And you do have definitions here already. Catabolism it's the reactions that involve the breakdown of complex, larger structures or molecules into smaller, simpler ones. And these reactions tend to release energy. So this side of the PowerPoint slide shows you a catabolic reaction. If you take a larger molecule, break it apart into individual pieces, and that often also results in energy release. Anabolism is pretty much the exact opposite of that. So if you take a bunch of smaller molecules and you use energy, typically these reactions do require energy because you're building new bonds between these smaller atoms or molecules, and then you're building a brand new larger molecule. That is anabolism. Okay, so I'm going to go on to other types of reactions, and you will see these a lot in metabolism. These are called oxidation and reduction. So I'll give you a quick definition and then just explain what they mean. Oxidation involves the removal of electrons and hydrogen ions. From a molecule. Okay, so it's the removal of electrons and hydrogen ions. And one thing you may also want to note here is when you remove those two things, electrons and hydrogen ions, it also removes energy from that molecule. Okay, the other reaction, reduction, is the exact opposite. So instead of the removal, this is the gain of electrons and hydrogen ions by a molecule.
Sorry, can you repeat that for me?
It's the gain of electrons and hydrogen ions by a molecule. So when that is happening, the molecule is also gaining energy. And almost always, these reactions occur simultaneously with two different molecules. So when one molecule is being oxidized and it is losing electrons and hydrogen ions, the other molecule is being reduced and it's gaining electrons and hydrogen ions. So you're just taking those things away from one molecule and transferring them onto another.
If you're experiencing symptoms,
Caitlin, you have a question?
primary care provider. If you have general questions about the coronavirus,
Okay.
please call the
Okay, so does that make sense? So you're just removing them from one, giving them to another. So usually it happens at the same time with two different molecules. Okay, and let me see. Let me just define coenzymes real quick. Actually, yeah, I'm gonna go through this whole next page, and then I'll give you guys a quick break and we'll come back and do just a little bit more that's at the end of the outline. So the term, let me go to the next slide. The term coenzymes, this refers to vitamins. These are typically vitamins that work with enzymes to perform reactions, especially they're involved in those redox reactions, which is the abbreviation for the reduction and the oxidation that we just talked about. So when these coenzymes get reduced, they will gain hydrogen ions and electrons. When they get oxidized, they lose those things. So coenzymes are often involved in these reactions. They will either get reduced or they'll get oxidized in the process. And there's 3 different coenzymes that are involved with metabolism that you guys will see in these different metabolic reactions. So you have all the information in your outline about them already. The first one, and you definitely don't need to know the full name of it, it's very long. We always just call it NAD. You can see what that stands for. If you don't need to know the full name, as long as you know NAD. That is that's its oxidized form when it does not have hydrogen ions and electrons on it. It can be reduced, and then if it is reduced, it gains hydrogen ions and electrons. So then it becomes NADH plus H, because now it has those H's, those are the hydrogens. So remember, when a molecule gets reduced, it's not only gaining hydrogen ions and electrons, but it's also gaining energy. So when these coenzymes get reduced, they're being given energy, and that energy can later, and it will later be used to make ATP. So that last thing there, that last bullet under NAD, it says NADH plus H contains the potential energy to eventually form, and what you can fill in there is that it contains the potential energy to eventually form 2.5 ATP molecules. And there is another coenzyme that's very similar. It's called FAD. So it can be reduced. It can get hydrogen ions and electrons and energy. And when it gets reduced, it now becomes FADH2. When it has the H's on it, you know that that is the reduced form, because if it's been reduced, it's gaining hydrogen ions plus electrons and energy. So when it becomes reduced, it's gaining energy, and FADH2 contains the potential energy to eventually form 1.5 ATP molecules. So basically, these two coenzymes, their role in metabolism is to get reduced. And when they get reduced, they're gaining hydrogen ions, electrons, and energy. The most important part is that they're gaining energy, and that energy is eventually going to be used to make ATP. Here is a quick poll question related to what we're talking about. It should be visible now. This one is a little tricky. So think about it, and I can't see who answers what. All I can see is the answers that you give. So don't think that I'm looking, or that I can't even see what answer you're giving. I can just see overall the answers that have been selected. Okay, so we have some for the first three. All right, I think we have almost all of you guys that participated, so I'll end the poll. I will share the results. You should be able to see. So this is tricky. This is really tricky. The molecule that all cells use for energy, that they are, now I could have been a little clearer maybe and said that they're using directly for energy, the answer is ATP. If you said glucose, I know what you were thinking, and that was a good thought. So these cells are using glucose to make ATP, which is then what is used for energy. So they're kind of indirectly using glucose for energy. But so this is important. I'm glad that you guys did answer that way, because it'll clarify this. You are very much right that I said glucose is what cells are going to use to make energy. But glucose can't directly be used by cells for energy. The cells, all your cells, are getting glucose, but before they can use it for energy, they have to convert it into ATP. So now you guys all know that, right? So glucose is used to make energy, and the energy that's made is ATP. And then that is the molecule that actually gets used by the cells. All right, so good. If you answered either one of those, you're right. If you said triglycerides can actually be used for energy, but you would always, or they can be used to make ATP to get energy. But remember, first you would always use glucose, then you can start using triglycerides. But no matter what, either one of these two things is going to be converted into ATP first and then used for energy. All right, I feel like I was going to say something else and I don't know. So, all right, let me keep going then. There is one more coenzyme, and that is coenzyme A. This coenzyme actually isn't involved in the reduction oxidation reactions. All it does is it acts as a carrier molecule. So that just means it'll attach to a molecule and carry it where it needs to go, either into another cell, from the outside of a cell to the inside of a cell, to a different location within a cell. So it's just acting as like a transportation mechanism for other molecules. It's helping to move them around. So it's just a carrier. Okay, last thing I want to do before we take the quick break is to just go through some other reactions that you'll see in metabolism. And some of these, the names tell you, or they give you a good idea of what's actually happening in the reaction. The first one doesn't. So I'll just give you a simple definition for that first one. It's called isomerization. And this means a change in the structure of a molecule without a change in its chemical formula. Okay, so basically what's happening with isomerization is you're not changing the chemical formula of the molecule at all, which means that you're not adding any atoms, you're not removing any, adding or removing anything. So if you start off with 6 carbons, 6 oxygens, and 7 hydrogen atoms, that's what you're gonna still have. But what you're doing is rearranging the molecule. So if you look at glucose and fructose, glucose can go through an isomerization reaction to become fructose. If you look, and you don't have to count, but you can, if you want to prove this, you can see that these two molecules have exactly the same chemical formula. It means they have the same number of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen atoms. So we haven't added anything, we haven't taken away anything. But look, there is a different arrangement. Now the carbon that is double bonded with an oxygen, instead of being the very first carbon, it's the second one. So they've just rearranged like the order of the atoms a little bit, and that changes the entire molecule, that changes the name. So that's isomerization, just a rearranging of the atoms within a molecule. Hydration. So this shows you a hydration reaction. Can you see what's happening here? This is what you're starting with, and this is what you're ending with. Look at the middle. This is the actual reaction. What's going on? You are adding.
Adding water.
Yep. This is the addition of a water molecule. So what would dehydration be?
Taking away the
Taking
water
water.
molecule.
Yep, exactly. You're both right. So removal or taking away a water molecule. It's the exact opposite. The next one is, I have an example here, decarboxylation. So here's the reaction. Can you see what's happening? Whenever you have the D, it's a removal of, what's that?
Carbon.
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide, yeah. Removal of a carbon dioxide molecule. I don't have it here, but what if you saw just carboxylation?
Adding carbon dioxide.
Yeah. Yep. So the name, you can tell the name kind of is telling you what's happening. What about, so the next two we have are phosphorylation and dephosphorylation. Phosphorylation is the addition of a phosphate group. And dephosphorylation is the opposite. That's removal of a phosphate group. All right. So the entire next page and then all the subsequent pages going all the way through aerobic respiration are covered very well in that recorded lecture. When we come back, because I'm going to give you guys like a 5-minute break, I'll just give you like a 1-minute overview of what aerobic respiration is. Just because it might help with your understanding of what we'll talk about next. So I'm not going to do a ton more, maybe 20 minutes, but we'll skip like to the end of the outline to cover some stuff that you don't have a recording for. So we cover the maximum amount of stuff. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a break. It is 10:33. So you want to come back at 10:38. We'll take 5 minutes and then I'll start up and I'm not going to do a lot more, but we'll cover some of the end. All right, so I'll see you in a couple minutes. All right. I'm going to get our PowerPoint up again, and then I'll start up in just a minute. I'm going to skip ahead a little. Okay. So I am going ahead to, now I feel like my page, I think I'm one page number off, but it should be your page 13 that starts with carbohydrate metabolism at the top. Oh, wait, no, because you guys have yours split into two. I have one big document and you guys have two separate study outlines, right? So this
would be
would
number one.
What'd you say?
It would be number one.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense. I think you're right. Yeah, because sorry, I have mine in one big document and I took yours to split it into the two. So you have like two separate ones. And yeah, I think you're right. That is the very beginning of the second one. So this is, so yeah, it should be the very first part of the second study outline that has at the top carbohydrate metabolism. So I'm going to go through probably just that first page to cover carbohydrate metabolism. And then I'm going to skip ahead to metabolic states of the body. I want to cover that part too. But just really quickly, I promised like a quick overview of aerobic respiration. Remember I said that glucose is the main molecule that is used by the body to make ATP, and then it's the ATP that actually is the energy source. So aerobic respiration, also called cellular respiration, is the entire process that involves the breakdown of one glucose molecule to make ATP. So it's actually a series of 4 steps. And that's what the recorded lecture is going through. It thoroughly explains those 4 steps in the process of breaking down a glucose molecule to get ATP. And then once you have that ATP is what is used as energy to give your cells energy. So this shows you like the overall reaction of aerobic respiration. You take one glucose molecule. It does require oxygen to be present in the body to have this reaction occur. And then the result is, the main thing is ATP. You get a bunch of ATP molecules from breaking down that glucose, but also a couple of byproducts of aerobic respiration are carbon dioxide and water. So these are produced as byproducts. The primary product and the primary goal of aerobic respiration is to make ATP. So I am going to, let's see. Yeah, gonna go now to that very first part of the second study outline, where it goes through carbohydrate metabolism. It actually goes through the metabolism of the 3 main macronutrients. So it starts with carbohydrates, and then it'll have lipid metabolism, and then protein metabolism. So we'll start with the carbohydrate metabolism. And basically, you want to have, no matter what you're doing, whether you're eating or whether you haven't eaten in hours, your body's goal is to maintain a pretty steady level of glucose in your blood. When glucose is in the bloodstream, it's easily available for cells to basically grab and then use to make ATP. So carbohydrate catabolism, so that's the breakdown of carbohydrates, the main one being glucose, is performed through cellular respiration, which is the process I was just describing. And the 4 steps involved in cellular respiration are listed right there. So again, that's what I go over in that recorded lecture. And then you can see the overall reaction, which is what I just showed you guys here on the PowerPoint slide. That's written out for you. So you can see from one glucose molecule, and that, if you're looking at your outline, that's C6H12O6, which is right here. That is the chemical formula for glucose. So when you see that chemical formula, that is glucose in your outline. So you can see from one single glucose molecule, you end up with, after you perform cellular or aerobic respiration, you end up with 30 to 32 ATP molecules. So you get quite a bit of ATP from just one single molecule of glucose. Okay, so that is the breakdown of glucose. It is just the whole process of cellular or aerobic respiration. Carbohydrate anabolism, though, this is forming carbohydrates. So there's a couple different processes that can occur to form a carbohydrate. Glycogenesis is the first one. And right next to it, you can put that glycogenesis is putting many glucose molecules together to make glycogen. So taking glucose and just linking a bunch of glucose molecules together to make glycogen. So this will happen when you have excess amounts of glucose that you don't need right away. You're going to take that extra glucose and link it all together, just create bonds in between all those little glucose molecules, and that makes glycogen. Glycogen is basically the storage form of glucose. When you want to store glucose, you link all the glucose molecules together to make glycogen, and then you can store it that way. So you'll do that when you don't need glucose immediately for ATP. So maybe, you've eaten a big carbohydrate rich meal and right away you use all the glucose that you need for energy. But if you have excess left over, you're going to store it for a later time. And that process, glycogenesis, is promoted by insulin. So when your body releases insulin, it's going to cause that reaction to happen. It's going to cause glucose molecules to link together and to become glycogen. So that is caused by insulin. The exact opposite of that is glycogenolysis. So that is when you take glycogen and break it apart into individual glucose molecules. Okay, so your body will do that when glucose is needed for energy. So let's say, after you ate that big carbohydrate rich meal and you used all the glucose you needed for energy right away and then stored what was left. Well, maybe an hour or two later after you haven't eaten, now blood glucose levels start to drop. So what your body will do is take that glycogen that you've now stored and break it apart to release glucose into the bloodstream. So now you can bring your blood glucose levels back up again. This process is promoted by glucagon. So glucagon is the hormone that causes glycogen to break apart into glucose. And that releases glucose into the blood. Okay, so those two reactions happen all the time. All the time. There is a third one called gluconeogenesis. And this is the formation of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source. So normally, the easiest way to get glucose if you need ATP is to, take glycogen that you've stored and you take it and you break it apart and you get glucose. But if there's no more glycogen, then you're going to have to make glucose from something else. So for the occurrence, it says that this is going to occur when there's no more glycogen available to make glucose. So that's normal. Like that'll often happen a little bit every day to you. Like so after like an hour of not eating, you're going to take glycogen and you're going to break it apart. But then if you've gone a couple hours without eating, which is pretty normal, then you've already used up all your glycogen. Now you're going to have to use something else. So you'll likely use, what do you use second if you've used up your glucose and your glycogen, which are carbohydrates? What would the next source be?
Lipids.
Yeah, good. So you'll most likely turn to lipids, your fat stores. And then you can take that and break it apart and convert it into glucose and then use that to get ATP. So that'll often happen on a small scale every day. But this process will happen on a larger scale if the individual is malnourished or starving.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if we call that starving, is the keto diet, we call it starving too?
Yeah. So when I say starvation, you're absolutely right. That is another situation where this would occur on a larger scale. So that's not starvation. It's just that you're not intaking carbohydrates as much as you would with a normal diet. So when I'm going through all of this, I'm assuming a somewhat normal diet where at least about 50% of your calories come from carbohydrates. But you're absolutely right. There's popular keto diets, like the Atkins diet was popular years ago. It was a form of like a keto diet. So in that case, you're taking in very few carbs. And this would happen in that case. But that's not a situation where you're starving because you are still getting nutrients, you're getting calories. It's just from not the usual source. So yeah, good question. Okay, and one last thing, the process of gluconeogenesis of basically converting lipid, fats, or proteins into glucose is promoted by the hormone cortisol. And that's spelled right here if you need spelling. So your body can take proteins, it can take the amino acids from proteins to make glucose, or it can take the glycerol from fats and convert that into glucose. I am going to just give you, I don't want to go through, well, I don't really have time to go through everything coming up, but I at least want to go through the definitions related to lipid and protein metabolism. So basically there's catabolism and anabolism for both. Lipid catabolism is called lipolysis. Basically, whenever you see the lysis ending, that means breakdown. And whenever you see genesis as the ending or as the suffix, that means creation of or building. So lipid catabolism is lipolysis. That's breaking down lipids. And I'm going to skip down. In the process of breaking down lipids, you may have ketogenesis. Do you guys see the term ketogenesis? Just a little further down in the outline. Ketogenesis is the formation of ketone bodies. Formation of ketone bodies. So that can occur if there is a large amount of lipid breakdown. Like if your body is breaking down a large amount of lipids at a time. It can lead to the formation of these ketone bodies. So that's called ketogenesis. Okay, so eventually, those ketone bodies, they're acids. Those ketone bodies are all acidic. But eventually they can be used. They can be converted back to the components of lipids that they came from and just be broken down for energy. But if they start like accumulating too much in the blood, it's called ketosis. So ketosis is the condition where ketone bodies accumulate excessively in the blood. Okay, so that really only happens if you're using a large amount of fat continuously as your primary energy source rather than carbohydrates. So that would happen if you are on a keto type diet, like a very low carb diet. That could also happen if you are starving. So you're simply not getting you're not intaking enough nutrients, and therefore your body starts breaking down all of its fat stores for energy. And it can also happen if you're suffering from uncontrolled diabetes. And the reason, why do you think this could be dangerous? Why can ketosis be dangerous? Remember what I said ketone bodies are. They are acids. So what if they start building up?
Could it throw up your pH in your blood?
Absolutely. Yeah. So all these ketones start building up in the blood. It's going to drive the blood's pH down. And that can result in it's called metabolic acidosis. Any kind of acidosis is a condition where the body's pH is becoming too acidic. Okay. And so that's all related to breaking down fats. That's lipolysis. Lipid anabolism is lipogenesis. So that will happen if you ingest more calories than you actually need. You will store as much of the excess glucose as you can as glycogen. Remember, we talked about that. If you have excess glucose, you're going to put them all together and make glycogen. But you can only store a certain amount of glycogen. It's stored in your liver and in your muscles. And if you can get to a certain point where you simply can't store any more glycogen. If that happens, then you're going to store all that excess glucose as fat. It's going to be converted into fat and stored that way. And any excess triglycerides that you eat will be stored as fat as well. So just know that excess carbohydrates, I mean, if possible, they're going to be stored as glycogen. But at a certain point, you simply can't store any more glycogen, like your storage areas get filled. And then any excess carbohydrates get stored as fat. Okay. So for protein metabolism, breaking down proteins is called proteolysis. And generally, remember, we are not using proteins for energy. So generally what happens is that, so this is the very first section under protein metabolism. Proteins will be broken down into amino acids. That's the first step there. But what you can add here is that most of these amino acids are reused to make new, different proteins. Generally, we're not going through the rest of the breakdown process because we're not using proteins for energy. Typically, we're using carbohydrates and fats for energy. So what your body does with proteins is it will break them apart into their individual amino acids, but then it will take those amino acids and like recombine them and reuse them to make a brand new protein. Because remember, there's so many different proteins in the body that do so many important things. Chances are you're going to need to reuse those amino acids to make one of those important proteins, like hemoglobin, like antibodies that are part of your immune system, actin, myosin in your muscles, keratin, collagen. There's so many different things that it's very likely that you'll need to make a new protein at that time using those amino acids. So most often that is what happens to the proteins after you ingest them and you break them apart into the individual amino acids. Okay. Protein anabolism, there is not a specific term for protein anabolism. It's just called protein anabolism. So that's making new proteins. And at this point, I am gonna skip to, you guys go to the next page, the metabolic states of the body. I just want to go through that as my last main section for today. Do you guys see where that is on the next page after it discusses protein metabolism? Okay, so basically you're constantly breaking down organic molecules like carbohydrates and proteins and fats and rebuilding new organic molecules. And typically the rate of breaking down these molecules is the same as the rate that you're making new ones. So everything stays pretty much the same. Let me get to the right slide real quick. Okay. We have, in order to meet the energy needs of your cells, because remember, cells constantly need energy to perform whatever function they perform and just to stay alive, basically. There are different nutrient pools in the body. There's the amino acid pool, which is just all of the free amino acids kind of floating around in the body. And most of these amino acids are used to make new proteins. We just talked about that a minute ago. So most amino acids that you have in the body are used.
Sorry, are we on page 4? 5? Okay, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, because I'm all off of my numbers. And so it's the very beginning of the section called metabolic states of the body. Okay, so yeah, they're used to make new proteins. Your body tries to hold on to these as much as it can, because they're so valuable. You need them to make new proteins. So only a very small amount of these amino acids are lost through shedding your hair and your skin cells. Because you have proteins and amino acids in your hair and in your skin. So when hair falls out, which happens all the time, and skin cells are being sloughed off, you are losing a very, very small amount of these amino acids, but for the most part, they are retained by your body and they are reused. The other main nutrient pool is the carbohydrate and fat pools. And these are typically just grouped together because carbohydrates can be converted to fat and vice versa. So these are the two nutrients that are typically broken down to produce ATP. Amino acids can't directly be used to make ATP. They have to be converted into something else first. And carbohydrates and fats can be stored as they are. So carbohydrates are stored as glycogen. Fats are stored exactly as they are in adipose tissue. They don't even have to be converted into something different. But amino acids cannot be stored as proteins. So if you have excess amino acids, and this is rare, but if you have excess amino acids and your body can't reuse them to make a new protein for some reason, they can't be just stored. They have to be converted into either glycogen or fat and then stored. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview of the main nutrients and their uses and how they can be stored. There's two, at really any given time, there's two metabolic states that your body might be in. There's the absorptive state and there's the post-absorptive state. And basically, if you can remember one, the other one is the exact opposite. So it will help you in memorizing one of these. You'll know the other one because everything is just exactly the opposite, pretty much. So the absorptive state is also known as the feasting state because this is when you're eating, you've just eaten. And this is the time when anabolism, so when you're building brand new molecules, this is happening at a much greater rate than catabolism. So for occurrence, this occurs when an individual has just eaten a meal. and it lasts for about 4 hours. Okay, so basically, if this is when you've just eaten, so this is also assuming that you've eaten a balanced diet. You're not on any kind of special diet that's low carb or high fat or high protein, just like a normal diet. So you've gotten carbs, proteins, and fats. So at this point, if that's the case and you've just eaten, the primary source of energy would be what type of nutrient? If you have all three available to you, what's the main one that you would use for energy?
Carbohydrate.
Good, yep. So main source of energy would be carbohydrates, specifically glucose, because any carbohydrate can be easily turned into glucose. Okay, and then you have written there in your outline that fats and amino acids that have been ingested will be used to make new proteins. Remember, any proteins you eat are broken apart into amino acids and then reused typically. And then fats will be used to replace the fat stores that you maybe had to use up in the previous hours when you had not been eating. You have to start like dipping into your fat stores. So now by eating fat, you're replenishing your fat stores. And any excess nutrients will likely be turned into fat and then stored if they're not used right away. And then for hormonal control, insulin is released to move glucose. Basically, it's moving glucose out of the blood so it can be stored. Okay. So just keep in mind that the next part of this is just filling in the chart where we'll say if these reactions are occurring during the absorptive state or if they're not occurring during the absorptive state. So just really quickly think about the absorptive state and what it means one more time. You've just eaten, so you have all of the nutrients available. And mainly what you're going to do, I mean, you're going to definitely use what you need right away for energy. You'll use some glucose and use it, your cells will use it to make ATP. But then the rest of what you're doing is you're storing all of these excess nutrients so that you have them to use later at a time when you haven't eaten. Okay, so now you have to go back and remember what these reactions mean. Glycogenesis. So glyco refers to glycogen. Genesis means you're forming it. So this is forming glycogen. Remember, to know if this is going to be occurring at this time or not, remember what glycogen is. This is formed when you take a bunch of glucose, like when you have a lot of extra glucose, you put it all together and you form glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose. Would that be occurring at this time? And if you want to do like a thumbs up or thumbs down icon thing, or just answer or don't answer if you're not sure. Okay.
No. Will not be here.
So thank you for answering, but actually it would be happening because you've just eaten. So we're going to assume you have a lot of excess nutrients. which is typically the case. If you've eaten, you usually eat more than you need in terms of energy right at that moment. So you have excess and you're gonna have to store it. The way that we store glucose is by making glycogen. So yes, we would be performing glycogenesis because that's the way that we store all of this excess glucose that we've just eaten. So yes, you can put a check mark or put a yes next to glycogenesis. That would be happening. Okay, the next one is glycogenolysis. That's the breakdown of glycogen. Would you need to be breaking down glycogen at this time? No, I see shaking heads. That's right. No, you're actually, you're making glycogen. You're taking all these excess nutrients and storing them. You don't need to break down glycogen. You would only do that if you didn't have glucose available to you at that time. And you definitely do. You've just eaten. You've got tons of glucose in your blood right now. So no, that would not be happening. And now remember what this means, gluconeogenesis. That's when you're making glucose from a non-carbohydrate source because you don't have glucose available to use for energy. Would that be happening now or no? No, that's right. Because you do. That would only happen if you did not have glucose available to use for energy, but you do. You've just eaten. You have a lot of glucose in your blood at this point. So you definitely would not have to do that either. Okay, so you've eaten a big meal, you've eaten carbohydrates and fats and proteins. Lipogenesis. Lipogenesis is basically making lipids and storing lipids. Would that be happening?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the time where you have all these extra nutrients and you're storing all of the extra nutrients. So glycogenesis was happening. You're storing excess glucose. Lipogenesis is happening because you're storing your excess fats. So yeah. Would lipolysis be happening? That's breaking down fats. No. You've just eaten, you have tons of glucose, you're using that for energy. You don't need to be breaking down your fat stores for energy because you've got tons of glucose. So no, that would not be happening. And then finally, protein synthesis. Do you think that would be happening? So again, you've just eaten, we're assuming you've eaten protein. So now you have all these individual amino acids kind of floating around. Would you be making new proteins at this time? I see a yes and a no. You would be making new proteins because you've just eaten protein and you have all these amino acids from that protein. And remember, mainly what you do with those amino acids is reuse them and kind of recombine them to make new proteins. So yeah, that would be happening at this time. Proteolysis is breaking down proteins. Would that be happening? No. Okay. Good. I am running out of time, so let me get to the post-absorptive state. I'm going to skip that section on diabetes really quickly. You have almost all the information there for it anyway. The other situation is the post-absorptive state. So like I said, this is pretty much the exact opposite of the absorptive state. This is when you're performing a lot of catabolic reactions. You're breaking down the nutrients that you have stored. because this is the time where you're in between meals. You have not eaten for hours, but your body is still trying to maintain a blood glucose level at a certain amount. So in order to do that, since you have not just eaten, which would release nutrients into your blood, you're going to have to go to everything that you've stored, glycogen, fat, and you're going to break it down to release nutrients into the blood so that it's available for your cells to use. So sources of energy at this time, it's just all of your stored nutrients. And I've listed them in the order of how you would use them. Remember, we've said this, and I think you guys know by now, you're always going to use carbohydrates first in the form of glucose. So first, you're going to use your glycogen, because that is the stored form of glucose. You're going to use glycogen stored in your liver. Then you're going to use the glycogen stored in your muscles. Then if that gets totally used up, then you're going to use the fat that's stored in your adipose tissue. If that gets totally used up, which is going to take a while because we have a decent amount of fat stored, then you would use protein. So during the first state that we talked about, the absorptive state, remember it was insulin that was being released. At this point, it's the opposite hormone that gets released, which is glucagon. Glucagon does the opposite of what insulin does. Insulin lowers blood glucose levels. Glucagon raises blood glucose levels. So we can go through this really quickly. It's basically the exact opposite. This chart is the exact opposite of what we just said. For the absorptive state. So at this point, instead of all the like genesis and synthesis reactions, you're basically breaking down your stored nutrients. So glycogenesis, are you making new glycogen at this time? No, you don't have glucose to make it out of. So no, that's not happening. Instead, what's happening is you're breaking down your stored glycogen to get energy. So glycogenolysis is happening. You might even need to be performing gluconeogenesis. So that's likely happening too. Because if you run out of your stored glucose, you're going to have to make glucose from another source. So that's probably going to happen too. Lipogenesis, that's making and storing lipids, that's not going to happen. But instead, what you're doing is lipolysis. You're breaking down your stored fat to release nutrients into the blood. So that is happening. And then protein synthesis is not happening. You've not just eaten. So you don't have all these free amino acids that you can just use to make new proteins. But proteolysis, breaking down proteins, yeah, that might be happening if you've used up all the carbohydrates and fats that you have stored. Then you would have to use your proteins. So pretty much the exact opposite of what we just said for the absorptive state. Okay, so I am going to stop there because we're 2 minutes over our allotted time for class. So I apologize for going over time. I just wanted to finish that section for you guys so you at least had that whole thing filled out. So between this and that big recorded lecture for that whole middle section, you now have pretty much your entire outline filled out. This very last section is pretty easy, the metabolic rate and heat production section. But you guys have a full week before you have this test. So as you're going through, if you have any questions or you need anything else from me to help you with the study outline or to prepare for the test,